Welcome to Unadulterated Adultery Confessions channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. Sophia sat quietly in the bustling Nairobi airport lounge, her fingers nervously drumming on her leather bag. 68, she felt out of place among the travelers half her age. This trip to Africa was supposed to be her escape, a desperate attempt to break free from the solitude that had consumed her since her husband passed 3 years ago. But the loneliness had followed her here, refusing to loosen its grip. As she shifted uncomfortably in her chair, a young man entered the lounge, his confident stride drawing her attention. He was tall, with a bright smile that seemed to light up the room. Sophia noticed how effortlessly he interacted with the staff and other travelers, his charm evident in every gesture. When their eyes met, Edward's expression softened and he walked over. "Excuse me. Do you need help with your bag?" he asked, his deep voice. Warm and inviting, Sophia hesitated for a moment before nodding. She'd been struggling with the oversized suitcase since leaving the hotel, but her pride had stopped her from asking for assistance. "Thank you," she said softly as Edward hoisted the bag onto his shoulder with ease. "I didn't want to trouble anyone." "It's no trouble," Edward replied with a grin. "It's part of my job as a guide." "Are you here for the safari tour?" Sophia nodded again, surprised by his intuition. "Yes, I am. It's my first time in Africa. I've always wanted to visit, but life got in the way." Edward studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Well, you're here now, that's what matters." They fell into easy conversation as they waited for their respective groups to be called. Edward spoke about his work as a guide and his dreams of one day starting his own tea company. Sophia found herself drawn to his enthusiasm and ambition. He seemed so full of life, so sure of his place in the world, a stark contrast to the emptiness she'd been feeling. "And you?" Edward asked, breaking her reverie. "What brought you here?" Sophia hesitated. How could she put into words the ache of losing her husband? The endless days spent alone in a house that no longer felt like home. Instead, she offered a small smile. "I suppose I wanted an adventure." Edward nodded as if he understood more than she was, saying, "Africa is full of adventure, you'll see." When the announcement came for their groups to board, Edward helped her with her bag once more. As they parted ways, he turned to her with a playful smile. "Maybe we'll meet again. The world has a funny way of bringing people together." Sophia watched him go, feeling a strange flutter in her C*****T. She shook her head, chastising herself for her foolishness. He was young, vibrant, and full of possibilities. And yet for the first time in years she felt something within her, a faint glimmer of excitement, a flicker of hope. The open plain stretched endlessly as the safari jeep bounced along the uneven path. Sophia sat in the back seat, her camera in hand, marveling at the vastness of the African landscape. Edward, seated in the driver's seat, glanced at her through the rearview mirror and smiled. "You'll want to keep your camera ready," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the engine. "This area is known for its elephants." Sophia adjusted her hat and aimed the lens toward the horizon. "It's incredible," she murmured. "I've never seen anything like this." Edward chuckled. "That's the magic of Africa. It has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." The jeep came to a stop and Edward hopped out, extending a hand to help Sophia. Touch was brief, but she noticed the warmth of his skin and the ease of his strength. Together, they walked toward a shaded area where a group of elephants grazed in the distance. As the afternoon stretched on, their conversation grew more personal. Sophia found herself sharing fragments of her life she rarely discussed. She told Edward about her years as a teacher, the joy she found in shaping young minds, and the emptiness that followed her retirement. Edward listened intently, nodding and understanding. "You know," he said, leaning against the jeep, "when I was younger, I always thought life would get easier with age, but hearing you talk, I realized the challenges just change." Sophia smiled faintly. "It's not the years that weigh you down. It's the things you lose." Along the way, the honesty in her words lingered between them. Edward looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I lost my father when I was 15, he admitted. It's why I started working so young to take care of my family." Sophia hadn't expected such vulnerability, but it deepened her respect for him. "You've done well for yourself, Edward. It's not easy to face life's hardships and still carry yourself with such grace." His eyes met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink around them. There was no age, no cultural divide, just three people connecting over shared pain and resilience. The spell was broken when Edward's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, speaking in Swahili. Sophia turned away, focusing on the elephants, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted. Later, as the group gathered around the campfire, Sophia noticed Edward's easy camaraderie with the others. He laughed and joked his charm, effortlessly pulling people in. Yet when his eyes found hers across the fire, there was a softness in his gaze that seemed meant only for her. When the night grew cold, Edward offered her his jacket. "You'll need this," he said simply. Sophia hesitated before accepting it, her fingers brushing against his. The small gesture sent a ripple through her, a reminder of the warmth she hadn't felt in years. As she lay in her tent that night, Sophia stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with confusion. She hadn't come here looking for anything beyond adventure, and yet Edward's presence was stirring something inside her, a longing she couldn't quite name. Camp was quiet under the canopy of stars, the distant sounds of wildlife, creating a symphony of the night. Edward approached Sophia with a careful smile, holding a tray with 3 glasses of wine. She looked up from her journal, startled but not displeased. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, placing the tray on the small table between them. Sophia hesitated for a moment before accepting the glass he offered. "This is thoughtful," she said softly, her voice almost drowned by the chirping crickets. "You've been quiet today," Edward observed, leaning back in his chair. His gaze lingered on her face, studying the lines of experience and grace that age had etched there. "I've had a lot on my mind," Sophia admitted, swirling the wine in her glass. "This trip has been different from what I expected, different good or different bad?" He asked, his tone light, but his eyes searching. "Good," she said quickly, then paused, "but complicated." Abai didn't press her, allowing the silence to stretch comfortably between them. The firefight cast flickering shadows on their faces, softening the sharp edges of reality. "Can I ask you something?" Sophia finally said, breaking the quiet. "Anything," Edward replied without hesitation. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life, like the person you were supposed to be got lost somewhere along the way?" Edward thought for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I used to after my father died. I felt trapped by responsibility, like my dreams didn't matter anymore. But then I realized something. The life you want doesn't just find you. You have to fight for it." Sophia nodded slowly, his words resonating with her. "I envy that clarity. I've spent so much time being what others needed me to be, a wife, a mother, a teacher. I don't know who I am outside of those roles. You're more than the roles you play." Edward said, his voice firm. "You're here, exploring the world that takes courage." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Sophia felt seen in a way she hadn't in Yi. The walls she had built around herself began to crack, letting in the warmth of his presence. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his. Touch was brief but electric, sending a jolt through both of them. Army didn't pull away his gaze, steady and unreadable. "I shouldn't have done that," Sophia said, pulling her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Why not?" Edward asked gently, his voice low. "Because it's inappropriate," she whispered, looking down at her glass. "Inappropriate doesn't mean wrong," Edward said, leaning closer. "Sometimes the things we're told not to want, other things we need most." Sophia's breath caught as his words hung in the air. Slowly, Edward reached out his fingers, brushing against hers again. This time she didn't pull away. The world seemed to shrink, leaving only the 3 of them in the glow of the firefight. When Edward leaned in, Sophia's heart raced, but she didn't stop him. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, soft and hesitant at first, but deepening with each passing second. It was a moment of surrender. And acknowledgement of something that had been building between them since the day they met. When they finally pulled apart, Sophia's eyes were filled with tears she couldn't explain. Edward reached up and gently wiped one away, his touch tender. "You're allowed to feel," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sophia didn't respond, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. All she knew was that for the first time in years she felt alive. The journey back to the city was filled with a silence that spoke louder than words. Sophia stared out of the window, watching the savannah give way to smaller villages and eventually the outskirts of Nairobi. Edward occasionally glanced at her, but neither of them addressed what had happened the night before. The hotel. Edward helped her with her luggage for what felt like the last time. Their eyes met briefly and Sophia opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Edward gave her a small, understanding smile and stepped back, allowing her the space to process. Later that evening, Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. A message from her daughter Melanie popped up. "Call me when you can." She sighed and pressed the call button, dreading the conversation she knew was inevitable. "Hi, Mom." Melanie's voice came through sharp but concerned. "How's the trip?" "It's been eye-opening," Sophia replied cautiously. Melanie hesitated before speaking again. "I've been worried about you. I know this trip was supposed to help you heal, but something feels off. Are you okay?" Sophia's grip tightened on the phone. She wanted to tell Melanie everything, the loneliness, the unexpected connection with Edward, the kiss that had shaken her to her core. But how could she explain something? She barely understood herself. "I'm fine, Melanie," she said instead, her voice steady but distant. "You don't need to worry about me." After the call, Sophia felt restless. She wandered to the hotel balcony, where the city lights stretched out before her. The cool night did little to calm her racing thoughts. She had made choices during this trip that defied every expectation she had set for herself. She wasn't sure if she regretted them, but she knew they had changed her. The next morning, Edward arrived at the hotel to escort her to the airport. The ride was quiet, but there was no tension between them, only an unspoken understanding. When they arrived, Edward stepped out to help her with her luggage one last time. As they stood at the curb, Sophia finally found her voice. "Thank you, Edward, for everything." Edward looked at her, his expression warm but bittersweet. "You don't have to thank me. You've taught me as much as I've taught you." Sophia smiled, but her eyes betrayed the sadness she felt. "I don't know what happens next." "Neither do I," Edward admitted. "But that's life, isn't it? We just have to keep moving forward." Before she could second-guess herself, Sophia reached out and hugged him. It was a brief embrace, but it carried the weight of all the things they couldn't say. When they pulled apart, Edward stepped back, giving her a small wave. As she walked into the terminal on the plane, Sophia sat by the window, her mind replaying moments from the trip, the laughter, the conversations, the kiss. They were memories she would carry with her forever. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt a quiet sense of resolve. Back home, Sophia began writing letters to Melanie. They were honest, raw accounts of her life, her grief, and her journey toward rediscovery. She didn't mention Edward by name, but his presence was woven into every word. Months later, she came across an article online about a young African entrepreneur who had started a successful tour company. The accompanying photo showed Edward standing proudly in front of a safari jeep with his team. Sophia smiled, her heart swelling with pride and a touch of longing. As she closed her laptop, she leaned back in her chair, a bittersweet peace. Settling over her life was unpredictable, messy, and full of surprises. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally living it. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories.